If I may, then I will continue. Would you have, without Olivier de France, I don't know if he wants to say something. If not, then I will say my remarks. Olivier, would you like?
Can you hear me properly?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I'll say a few words. I'm afraid I can't stay too long because I'm going to have to dash at some point at about 5:10 here in the UK, which is probably 6:10 for you over there. I wanted to take a leaf from Ambassador. Sorry, I wanted to take a leaf from Ambassador Ainic's book and show you this. I'll start with a map. This is I went to get it earlier during Ambassador Ainic's remarks. Then, if you can see it properly, it's a New Yorker cover, and essentially it starts on the 9th Avenue in New York with the Hudson River, Jersey, Kansas, Nebraska, and all the way in the distance, the Pacific Ocean. You can see 3 tiny little islands in the horizon, which are China, Japan, and Russia. And this speaks to what Ambassador Ainic was saying. It's a question of perception, and this question of perception makes it, gives you 2 different answers to the question that Anton, you were speaking of in the beginning. It's a very different, or at least it's a rather different question to ask, whether Russia is Europe and whether Russians are Europeans. I think if you think in terms of institutions and nation states, we're very much in this framework where basically it's very difficult for nation states to see the interests of other states in the international system, because the point of a nation state is actually to defend and promote its own interests. It's difficult, but nonetheless a tiny bit easier for people to see the interests of other people. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's a bit easier. And I'm based here at the European Studies Center at Oxford University, and we have this project. It's been running for a bit over a year, which is called Europe in the Changing World. And the whole idea is one of the few benefits of the pandemic and the kind of Zoom magic is that we've basically, over the last 12 months, we've basically held monthly seminars with European scholars talking across different time zones at the same time with Russian scholars, faculty and Russian students, but also Chinese faculty and Chinese students, Indian faculty and Indian students, and US faculty and US students, which has been wonderful because we actually, kept up that link during all of the Russian war. And it was one of the few channels through which we could actually, speak both to Russian, to the Russian people. Obviously, it's a very small sample of Russian people. It's very educated and and Russian intellectuals. But for example, one of the things that we heard in particular from Russian students is that they don't actually read Chinese literature or watch Chinese films. They read European literature and watch European films, which in geopolitical terms, slightly undermines the whole narrative of the whole Russia-China entente and stuff like that. So small things like that, where actually discussions with people with civil society, even just a sample of civil society, are actually fairly interesting, and they tend to show that the question of whether Russia is Europe or whether Russians are Europeans are two slightly different questions. If you look at it from the question of the institution and the nation states, then obviously what happened in February of this year is a real strategic rupture. I mean, strategic neutrality in Sweden had basically been enforced for 200 years. Finnish strategic neutrality had been enforced for the best part of 75,000 years, which means that that was even the case under Stalin. 2014, the first invasion of Ukraine, that the renouncement of these two countries to their strategic neutrality didn't happen. The fact that Denmark has chosen to opt into the common security and defense policy, to the EU's basically framework for security and defense, didn't happen in 2014. It happened, this year. So I think for sure what happened in February is a pretty kind of big strategic rupture. And in terms of the common European home, that obviously most famously Gorbachev, and it wasn't the first or the last time he talked about it, but it was in July 89 to his speech to the Council of Europe. Obviously, for the duration of Putin's reign, that basically dream that some scholars, some people nurtured, has very much gone down the drain, and that's broken, and probably for not just for the duration of Putin's reign, but probably for a bit longer. So in the short term, I understand if you take this institutional point of view, I understand why people use terms like the new Cold War and or this bandy around these types of phrases. But in the midterm, I understand this in the short term, because a lot of basically the focus is around NATO. A lot of the focus is around whether, for example, the rises in European security budgets, including the 10 billion euros for in the special budget for Germany, whether that is going to feed into the whole European security architecture, machine industry, or whether it's basically going to go to US hardware that you'll get off the shelf. So I understand the kind of terminology of the new Cold War in the short term for these kind of if you take the institutional worldview. In the midterm, I actually think that it might be a tiny bit different, because you've got all this proliferation of institutions that Serena was mentioning. So basically now, to manage European security, essentially, you've got NATO, you've got CSDP, you've got the OSCE, you've got the Council of Europe, you now have the European Political Community, there's the European Neighborhood Policy. So it's all, there's a French philosopher called Clément Rosset who used to say that all human activity is dedicated to avoiding the problems that are thrown up by the world, avoiding the actual problem. And it's actually true that sometimes it would seem that we create institutions not to deal with the problem, but just to evade some of the issues. I actually think that if you look at the European landmass, it kind of makes sense that it's mostly Europeans who deal with the problems of the European landmass, that they don't externalize it to other people, just because in IR geography matters. It's what I like the telling the joke of Marilyn Monroe's famous quote about the fact that gravity catches up with all of us in the end. In IR, it's geography catches up with all of us in the end. So it seems to me that in the midterm, just in this institutional worldview, in the midterm, it doesn't make sense to have all these institutions to deal with European security. On top of that, if you look at the borders, the strategic overlap and the geographical overlap now between the EU and NATO, and then you factor in all these other institutions, to me, the sense of institutional competition between these frameworks is going to start making less and less sense as time goes on. So hopefully, even the question of CSDP and NATO should, in my opinion, should kind of trickle into the sands, hopefully, over the midterm. In the long term, I think this institutional worldview is actually a bit limited, and obviously, this expression of new Cold War doesn't completely work. The most obvious difference is the fact that it's basic globalization, which you've talked about already in the seminar, because we're just all in the same economic space today. We have economic links that are much more integrated, and we're much more interdependent, but also in a much more integrated information space. So we were talking about the sort of fact that we looked like it was as if we were basically watching a reality TV show, right? We're in a Twitter war, basically a war that appears on in tweets, and it's also just a world in which you don't have to obviously choose between Moscow and Washington anymore. Nation states outside of Russia, outside of Europe, outside of the US, actually a lot of them want to stay in contact with everyone, including China. And this forces us to basically allow for the possibility that they might just have their own interests and worldviews. The fact that they're not with us doesn't necessarily mean they're against us. They might just have their own, possibly they might have their own interests. And that feeds into the fact that illustrates the fact that Europe is no longer at the center in the way it was during the Cold War. It's not at the center of this economic space. It's not at the center of this information space. It's not at the center of this this geopolitical space, which also ties into. I mean, there'd be a lot to say about Professor Sato, your presentation. I think what happened with the UN vote after the war and so on might actually suggest that what we call universal values. I think there's a case to be made that a lot of those universal values are, slightly Western values, but that's a different issue. We can talk about it later. The other thing is that if you look, I'm not a Russia specialist at all, and so I was very interested in all your presentations. It just seems to me, if you look at Russia itself, what I've gathered is that actually there's no universalist dimension to Putin's worldview. So correct me if I'm wrong. For me, he seems like basically a nationalist, pragmatic patriot. He doesn't have a sort of Russian Orthodox model that he wants to project across the world. He basically has this very embattled worldview, which for me, reminds me more of a sort of it reminds me more of Catherine the Great, the Russian Empire, more than any other period of Russian history. And I thought he referred mostly to Novorussia and to the Russian Empire much more than the USSR. And that historically he wants to go back to the Russian Empire more than the USSR. But I mean, I'm happy to, please shout me down, because I don't really know what I'm talking about. That's what it seems to me, and I'd be very happy to be contradicted. So anyway, I'll just finish with saying that what that means is that if you look in the long term, we live in a globalized world, and that this globalized world actually puts into contact not just institutions, but actually people, economies, cultures, norms, ideas, emotions, right? I work a lot on this relational kind of paradigm of international relations, and I think in the long term this matters. This matters a lot, and probably even a bit more than the interactions between these nation states and these states and these institutions. Nations and their cultural links actually matter. These underlying threads, these ideas, these norms, these emotions, these cultures that extend across states and also across nation states. So basically, Ukrainians are not Russians for sure. Ukrainians are definitely no longer Russians for sure. Russia is not Europe, and Russia is less Europe today than it was at the beginning of this year. Are Russians not Europeans? This, I don't know. I think in the long term, the jury is still out.
Thank you, Olivier. Interesting.